Thank you, Professor Gibb, for another excellent presentation. Thank you to Professor Hare. And at this point, we have a little over 15 minutes for Q&A. And so I will start with some of the questions that were entered into the Q&A box. And if you have others for the audience, feel free to add additional ones. But we'll start with those. The first question has to do with leading indicators for safety in construction. And this is really, I guess, for either one of you, if you care to address it. But I know in the US, there's a OSHA guidance document 3970 on using leading indicators. Is there anything similar in the UK when it comes to leading indicators for safety issues in the construction industry?
I'm not sure if Billy's there. I can respond in the first place. I mean, yes, there are leading indicators, generally speaking, in construction for health and safety, not just safety. Very important. I'm not sure that that's particularly a PtD issue. However, it is an important aspect. It's actually quite a lot harder, I think, to do leading indicators when you're talking about design implementation, because of the nature of most of the leading indicators, where you might say management walkabouts or increased training or so forth. There clearly are some things you could do. Training would be one of them, but most of our leading indicators would focus on the construction process rather than the design process.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. Professor Hare, do you care to add anything to that?
Yeah, Scott, can you hear me okay?
Absolutely, loud and clear. Fine,
good. Yeah, I don't need to repeat anything Alistair has said, only that we do have lists of proactive leading indicators published through the British Standards Institution. The current iteration is known as ISO 45001, but I find that a better list, a more comprehensive list, is under something known as OSAS 18001, which is Occupational Safety and Health Management Systems, or an acronym of that type. If anyone wants that, I can post a link to it.
Okay, very good. Thank you for that response. Another question that came in through the Q&A had to do with the issue of when you're eliminating a hazard through design, is there potential for creating other hazards, or have you seen that occur in your experience? So eliminating one hazard, but inadvertently creating others because of that.
Yeah, I think again, Billy, I'll shoot if you want. I think that's definitely the case, and clearly, depends on your philosophy as to whether you can ever eliminate all hazards from everything. But clearly, if you make some changes, you may well, and you are very likely to create other hazards. One good example to me, and this answers another question I think that I've heard people ask, is what are some good examples of prevention through design? One of them is do more work in the factory, prefabrication, off-site construction, modularization, whatever you want to call it. Now, does that eliminate hazards? It eliminates a lot of hazards, but it introduces other hazards. One example is it can, in a smaller project, introduce craneage to a project that never had craneage anyway, because if it was built by hand, there was no need for a mobile crane or whatever. You then prefabricate, you then bring a crane on site. The crane clearly has extra hazards. The difference is, in my opinion and experience, is the hazards that you create tend to be potentially larger consequences, but less likely, and therefore easier rather to manage. So providing you understand the hazards that you are creating and you're able to manage them, and that's where the interaction between designers and constructors is so important. Whereas many of the hazards in traditional construction, hand-built construction, are sort of ubiquitous, and they're there all the time, whatever you do. So yes, definitely hazards will be created, and you must look at those to see how they can be further reduced, or in some cases eliminated, or in some cases go back to what you thought about in the first place.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that answer. Another question that came from Charlie Hose has to do with the sort of looking at safety expertise amongst the safety personnel in general versus engineers and architects. and folks that would be more directly involved in some of the prevention through design aspects. I mean, how knowledgeable are architects in the UK on health and safety issues? And maybe this gets to some of the materials that Professor Hare was sharing that's been developed.
Yeah, I can take that, Scott. The results from one of the studies I showed in the video clip showed that architects not as comprehensively can identify hazards and promote control measures as well as civil engineers. And I think that's down to maybe the education system of the two disciplines. Having said that, architects in the UK are more exposed to this legislation, so therefore maybe have a beginning to have a greater understanding. I've not tested safety and health practitioners' knowledge of those same, those subject them to those same tests, but intuitively, I would have to guess that the safety and health practitioners we have within the construction industry in the UK, who themselves have a construction industry background, I would expect them to have a high score on those tests that I've run. But as of yet, I've not done that. Might give me an idea to do so and report that back to you next year.
Okay, very good. Thank you for that response. We also have a question from Professor Gambatees. He starts off by just saying, thanks for wonderful presentations. But he had a couple things. He says, do you think the UK would be at the same point in construction safety performance if the CDM regulations had never been implemented? And then also, if the CDM regulations were now removed, would designers still design for safety?
I think that's a super question, John. Thank you very much. I do think that CDM and prevention through design is part of the reason why our health and safety have improved. As I indicated in my presentation, I don't believe it's the only thing, and I don't think it's possible in a real world situation to be categorical about that. It's interesting that although we have left the European Union, we have decided to retain CDM. We don't need to, because we're no longer in the European Union. So we could scrap it entirely. And I don't think that there is any appetite to do that, certainly from my understanding. And when you have over the 30 years pretty much that it's been around, the architects, the good architects, by which I mean those that are engaging with construction in its entirety, not just health and safety, groups like NIOSH, as Billy mentioned there, have really come up with some good pragmatic ways of improving the health and safety of construction and maintenance and demolition workers and so forth, whilst not compromising the designs themselves. And that has taken some time to come to a level of maturity. So if the regulations were removed, I suppose in some parts of the sector, particularly smaller projects, smaller design practices, they would probably go back to what they did before. I think the big practices, the global client owners and so forth, then they probably would continue. Billy, I don't know what your thoughts are.
Sorry, I was trying to clear a box on my screen asking if Billy Hare's presentation was any good. So
we know the answer to that, don't we?
Yes. As my slides had shown earlier, I don't believe that legislation and indeed fines on their own achieve much more than compliance. A good example in the UK is the wearing of seatbelts. An introduction of a on-the-spot fine drastically improved wearing of seatbelts in the UK and driving vehicles in the UK. That's worked because it's a simple behaviour. It's one thing. You can link it, if it's correlation or causation. I'm going to put my neck on the line and say causation. And you can influence that. It's a very simple behavior. You're influencing compliance. When it comes to something as complex as design, I don't believe that CDM on its own has or can achieve that, or legislation on its own. What I do think is that the introduction of CDM reflected the culture within the UK and Europe at that time, where people in the industry almost embarrassed by the performance or the poor performance, and their sheer will and desire for change influenced it more than the regulation itself. And I think that's reflected in what Alistair has just said about there are still those within the industry who possibly ignore the legislation anyway until they are caught or something terrible happens. And if the legislation disappeared, their behavior would just return to as it was pre-CDM. But the vast majority of the population within construction, I think, have the ethical and moral drive, and that's what's made it happen.
Okay, we also have a question from Jack Toner. He says that we saw slides where a decrease in fatal accidents took place over time in the UK. What are your personal thoughts on the major contributors to why this took place? Or stated differently, what do you think drove the improvement?
I think there's a number of things. We could have a separate discussion and maybe a separate webinar on this whole topic. Client owners have stood up and have said this is not acceptable. I've been quoted many times with regard to London 2012 Olympic Park in London, where the man who was responsible, Lord Sebastian Coe, was told that if we build this the same way as we normally do, we'll kill 4 people on this project. And he said, no, we won't. And they didn't. Now, you know, that's an owner, that's a high profile person saying, you know, deaths on construction sites are not acceptable. You know, so client attitudes have changed. The industry training has got better in the industry. I mentioned some of the thinkers in terms of challenging how we do health and safety, of looking at cultural change, behavioral change, and not just compliance. I think there's a whole raft of things, to be honest. CDM, I believe, as we've said, as Billy and I have both said, I believe is part of it, but it's not the only one. It's a whole gamut, as it were, of changes that have occurred over the last 40 years, probably.
Okay, thank you. We've only got a few minutes left. Let me try to go through a few others quickly. Question from Mike Flowers. Has CDM pushed the need for fundamental HSE education into engineering and architectural schools, or is training left to the employers on the job?
Billy.
Yeah, just getting rid of another box that asked if Alistair Gibb's presentation was any good. The question, sorry, was has CDM helped to educate? Was that the question?
Sorry. Has CDM pushed the need for education in the engineering and architectural schools, or is it basically being done on the job?
Yeah, I think it has had an effect. Possibly not the effect that was intended, but in the UK and possibly elsewhere in the world, the response to any initiative or any legislation seems to be an increase in delivery of training. So there's always a training course that can be developed to satisfy your needs, whether that's the solution or not. But a nice consequence of that is that the education element does get through over time through a drip feed effect. So therefore, I would say that the general awareness and the understanding of what CDM is trying to achieve has had a positive effect on knowledge and understanding, and if you like, education. I think the second half to that implies that just contractors on the site are the ones that have made the biggest improvements. I would say a few years ago, I would have said yes, but as Alistair quite well put it in his presentation, the advent of the digital technology has allowed greater improvements. The increasing use of off-site pre-manufacture has been part of that improvement as well. But as both Alistair and myself have shown, I used the absolute fatal numbers. Alistair used the rate per 100,000, and both showed a similar thing, and that was that the rate drops before the introduction of the regulations, CDM in particular, at each increment, So you'd have to say, well, is that causation, or is it correlation, or is it neither? So again, it's a bit too muddy in terms of the data to give a convincing answer that CDM has had influence. I would say that it's been part of the jigsaw, but only a small part.
Okay, and then
I think
oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Sorry, just very quickly. I think in answer to the question about education and university education, I think those architecture schools that are linked to construction schools, that they have changed. Quite a lot of architecture, however, in the UK is taught from an arts-based, not a construction-based. And I honestly don't think the arts-based training of architects at university has changed at all.
Very good. With that, we'll go ahead and call this session a wrap. I want to thank Professors Billy Hare and Professor Alistair Gibb for their outstanding presentations. I want to thank the audience for joining us and for the excellent questions.